So all we needed to do, and the white folks understood that, is to say, black people are always open to be purchased. You can always buy them. So what we saw the BEE lot, and they got in there, they were bought, and suddenly they forgot. They started speaking the language of the white master. Every white person was a beneficiary of apartheid. So in doing so, we then exonerated white people, all of them, overnight. So reconciliation became a form of exoneration of white people from the white guilt, from having benefited from that system. There's nothing like a neutral educational process. Education serves as an instrument to integrate the logic, to integrate the younger generation into the logic of the process, of the present, or it becomes an instrument by which men and women can change the world. So there's nothing like a neutral education. So the education that we have still remains an apartheid-informed education.
In a world where Africans have lost their roots, it has become of vital importance to document our ways. In an effort to reverse the brainwashing of the past, where we were made to believe our ways are demonic, we are pressed to create dignified and respectful platforms to unpack our spiritual ways. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or position of this channel, its hosts, or affiliates. This podcast is a platform for open discussions and exploration of various perspectives, including controversial and unconventional ideas. We encourage viewers to think critically, do their own research, and form their own opinions. The content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be taken as fact, advice, or an endorsement of any specific viewpoint. Viewers' discretion is advised.
Umoya Ulight, Umoya Ubright. Welcome to another episode of MOYA Political Series, where we give you the information that's going to enable you to say the smart things in class. Thank you for always supporting the channel, guys. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And we thank you especially for watching all the adverts till the end, all of them. Please, guys, and thank you. And the members, obviously, we are just indebted to you for helping us keep the lights on here in studio. Thank you so, so much. Such a privilege. I don't know, we keep getting better and better, and the guests that we're getting are just incredible. Prof, I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh my gosh, we've been dying to have you. We've been dying to have you. You don't even need an introduction, but obviously the name will be on screen, but
Sure.
The work you've done. So we want to unpack leadership, black leadership, and what it has meant to us over the past 30 years. I mean,
Sure.
as we look at each president, what was actually happening? Because now we're seeing ourselves 30 years later and nothing has changed. In fact, things are a little bit worse. So can you help us start unpacking?
Well, I think the biggest challenge we had in 1994 is to misread the moment. We were so excited about the possibility of voting that we did not properly characterize that 1994 moment. And what we also did is to forget that the apartheid's decision to retreat was not an act of generosity. It came following struggles, following sacrifices. And what we did, unfortunately, we then began to read that moment as a change of heart by those who had oppressed us. So that was the first mischaracterization of 1994. We call it a breakthrough, but in truth, apartheid had become unworkable, and apartheid had become not profitable. And those who were beneficiaries of apartheid felt that the system needed to go. So you saw even white business participating in the notion that says maybe we need to start having a discussion with liberation movements. So that was the first thing that we need to appreciate about 1994. It was never an issue of a change of heart. It was simply a strategic retreat by the beneficiaries of apartheid to simply saying, now that we know the system is unworkable, now that we see that we are also isolated internationally, how do we find a way of remaining in charge without and giving black people a sense that they are in charge? So we got the Tutus to celebrate, and we called it a miracle nation, when in fact there were no miracles. People died. So that was the first mistake, to misread that moment. The second misreading of the moment was to think that the struggle for liberation was only about a vote, because all we did was simply to get a vote. But we should have known from the rest of the continent. But as South Africans, we thought there's something special about us. The rest of the continent would have learned from it that despite the fact that they got political liberation, there was always a challenge in terms of how do we take it forward. And Oliver Tambo did say that much earlier in 1981, that any struggle that does not lead to an economic struggle is a sham struggle. But we're too excited to get into positions. So effectively, we became less honest about ourselves, that some people were in it for themselves. You see, you had the people who were opposed to apartheid only to the extent that they were affected. But they had no problem in becoming junior partners of apartheid. So all we needed to do, and the white folks understood that, is to say, black people are always open to be purchased. You can always buy them. So what we saw the BEE lot, and they got in there, they were bought, and suddenly they forgot. They started speaking the language of the white master. So that is one issue that we also did not factor, that our own will later become a problem. And that's actually what happened. The third thing that happened was not to understand that when we start embarking on things like reconciliation, and if people read the notion of reconciliation and the truth and reconciliation, you can get excited in a sense that it revealed a lot. But in revealing a lot about what happened to black people, we then begin to individualize a system. Suddenly, apartheid was something that the de Kooks did, instead of it being a system. We grew up with a full understanding that apartheid was a system of subjugation. But overnight, apartheid became something like the people to be blamed were the people like de Kook, while everybody, every white person was a beneficiary of apartheid. So in doing so, we then exonerated white people, all of them, overnight. So reconciliation became a form of exoneration of white people from the white guilt, from having benefited from that system. So those are some of the mistakes that right now we must ask, how come 30 years later we're still in this position? And now the most disturbing part, which all Africans, irrespective of any political party, we should hang our heads in shame, that 31 years post 1994, we still occupy less than 5% of the land. You know, in terms of the statistics, the whites own 72% of farmland and agricultural holdings in terms of individual land owners. And yet they constitute about 9%. Now, here's the issue. We are no more better than we were in 1913 when the colonial government took the land from our people. So we have not made any progress. So that should not be an issue that you blame this party all black people should be saying, how can you be pariahs in the land of your birth? That is a crisis that we must address as African people, irrespective of any political party. And one must also give credence to the Youth League of the Malemas, who actually raised this issue sharply. The fact that the ANC began to tiptoe to the idea is neither here nor there. It was simply they were being embarrassed by the Youth League. And it's good that right now it's become a topical thing. But we need also to understand how that happened. It happened because we allowed our struggle to be reframed. Our struggle was always an anti-colonial struggle. If you read Mandela's speech, the Rivonia trial speech, it talks about, during my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to this African struggle. And when he comes to that, he goes further to talk about how, as a young person, he listened to the elders talk about the heroes of our struggle. And the careful reading of that comes down to the notion of that this was an anti-colonial struggle. And what we did was to make it a human rights struggle. And when you make it a human rights struggle, you move away from the land issue. It becomes about whether people have rights, whether people, you start now talking about individual rights. You no longer talk about the land dispossession. So that is the mistakes that we made from the moment of conception of the post-1994. But it goes beyond that because, as I said, we also assumed that our people are not up for sale. And that is very serious, that when you have people who are up for sale. And this is actually what happened to our people. They were easily bought, and they became a problem. And let me also put it very clearly. When people identify so-called revolutionaries and make them members of boards of companies, they're not inviting you into that space to advance the revolution. You are invited to frustrate it. So you saw most of the people who now are loudmouths. Most of them, if you look at carefully, they are members of white boards. And effectively, the white man always understood that when people are hungry, you can actually achieve a lot with them. So that is where we made the mistake. Then you come up with the idea of the constitution of this country, the one that everybody says is the best constitution in the world. And you ask, how come 30 years down the line, we have not made progress? But the reason is very simple. The constitution was brought in as a mechanism to build a sense of confidence among black people that, look, you may not get what you thought you should be getting, but we'll use the constitution to address progressively the challenge that you have. And when they use the word progressively, they say when the money is available. So effectively, if the money is not available, there's not much you can do. And they knew full well that they had bankrupted the state. And that's why Mandela said to black people that when we took over, we didn't know that we were inheriting a system that was bankrupt. So, but instead of acknowledging that, we had people who were busy celebrating. I mean, people like Tutu talking about being a miracle nation and all that. But those are the people who led to the mischaracterization of what apartheid was and what we're fighting against. But Mandela also goes further to say, in the 3 years that he has been in power, he has come to realize three things. One is that I expect the opposition parties to be against us. But I also discovered that the media, whose social base is white, are also part of the problem. And he says that in addition, we must also pay attention to what we call the NGOs. It says if you look at these NGOs, most of them are funded from outside. It's effectively saying they don't enjoy popular support. They are actually not really NGOs. And if you look at the role of the NGOs today, it's becoming very clear that they are not there to advance your interest. They are there every time they get into the public space. It is always about frustrating what you may call transformation. But what we fail to do, and this is also, I think, the crux of the book I want to write, why we failed, is to fail to appreciate that every moment of transition has seeds of failure, or they have the seeds of betraying that. The post-1994, when it occurred, there was always that possibility that the very structures that we find, especially when it's not a revolution, because when you have a revolution, the revolution allows you to uproot all the other systems in favor of the changes. But when you go through what we call a compromised system, the roots of failure become almost clear. And that's what we had. We had the roots of failure already written in the system. And how the roots of failure comes in is because we're keeping all the systems that were in place. What it means that the architecture, the colonial architecture, the apartheid architecture remains in place. Now I'll give you an example. Take, for instance, our housing policy. When we started building houses, we did what apartheid did. We built them away from our people. So effectively, we began to reproduce the system because our apartheid masters control the narrative. If you control the narrative, you control the future. And what they did, they made sure that all the instruments that control the narrative, the master narrative, are in their hands. And those are universities. You know, that's where we come in as clever blacks. Yes. And the clever blacks then start seeing things differently. Yeah. And then what we do, we end up becoming the defenders of the system that we're supposed to be fighting against. And you see us as those type of clever blacks. So, but part of it is because the system, every transition has those moments where the instruments of so-called success or the instruments that we're fighting against remain in place. So the apartheid system remained in place despite the fact in terms of its architecture. I mean, for instance, universities. If you look at the transformation within universities like UCT, they're still struggling with demographics. And you would have thought the universities would have been the first to say apartheid was evil. And therefore, we will make sure that change happens. But they have become part of the problem, in a sense that they have become the institutions that you cannot rely on in terms of changing. I mean, the last time, a few years ago, some members of black university academics at UCT said the percentage of black professors at UCT is less than 5%. And yet these are institutions that told us that they were opposed to the system when in fact they were beneficiaries of the system. Actually, Mamdani wrote that all South African universities are products of apartheid. And we chose not to listen to that because we didn't control the narrative. It took people like Mamdani who came from outside to say, but all of them, and it goes along with what Paul Freire said, that there's nothing like a neutral educational process. education serves as an instrument to integrate the logic, to integrate the younger generation into the logic of of the present, or it becomes an instrument by which men and women can change the world. So there's nothing like a neutral education. So the education that we have still remains an apartheid-informed education. So we have a lot to do, and we need to understand that the current dispensation, where South Africa is still a country of two nations, is not an accident. It is simply a manifestation of failure by African leaders, African intellectuals, to properly say, what are we dealing with? And if we dealt with that, things would have been easier. So what we are going to see is more of the same. And that's why we are where we are. And the one thing that Mandela also said, and I think people must read his speech, there are certain speeches that people have made sure that are not read. Mandela's speech in 1997, when he stepped down as the president of the ANC, and when he also dealt with the media, dealt with the NGOs, was also to say the reason why the forces of resistance are hell-bent to what they do. He says it's because they believe that in the distant future, they'll be able to reverse the gains of democracy. And we can see now the gains of democracy are being reversed. And they are reversed under our own watch, yes, by our own people.
Yes.
So this is what Mandela feared. What he didn't know is that his own party would be implicated in the reversal of those gains. So, but you will never see that speech of Mandela being put. And what you'll also not see is you have the Mandela celebrations in July the 18th. The best thing that people could do on that day is to read Mandela's statement in Rivonia. And when you read the statement, you realize how profound the statement was. Because in there, he says, when I grew up, I listened to the elders talk about the heroic deeds of African people. And I wished life would be so kind that I could be part of that struggle. They will never give you that. Instead, they have reduced the Mandela Day to be a day where you are going to pick up papers. Now, this is what you call the trivialization of Mandela by our people. So instead of us going back to talk about land, we talk about let's go and paint the school. Let's go and give kids food. But we don't talk about land, because the struggle against colonialism was an anti-colonial struggle which starts with dealing with land. So that's where we actually fail to deal with proper theorization of what the 1994 should have been. But there were some people who did warn us. People like Joe Slovo. He did say, we need to see this as an opportunity to launch, or how does he put it? He says, what we're faced with right now is that the new dispensation must be seen as another side of struggle. So that even if you are in government, you must see your role in government as engaged in the new form of struggle. But what we did not know is that for some people, 1994 was Uhuru. They had arrived. They were now able to make money. So they forgot about the rest of the people. So if we're to address this, we need to identify all those elements that led to our failure. Then you come also with the judiciary. What we did with the judiciary was to give the judiciary so much power that we saw a judicialization of South Africa, where the judiciary becomes the final arbiter to every dispute. So if you have a child problem with your child and there's a dispute, the courts have to deal with it. So that is also part of where we gave the judiciary too much power. But the people who gave that power in the constitution of the judiciary understood very well, because they understood that the judges who will be appointed, we are going to choose them. They are our products. They are products of our education. And once you have miseducated an African, you can, the Carter Woodson says in the miseducation of the Negro, it says, once you have a Negro who is miseducated, he'll know his place. That you don't even have to, it says, if he'll know that he has to be at the back, and if there's no door at the back, he'll create one for his benefit, because that's what his education has made him to understand, that you belong there. So we have a lot of miseducated Negroes, and they call themselves the best of us.
Black excellence.
Black excellence. But what they do is that the black excellence is always defined by whiteness. Yeah. That if white people say you're not good enough, then you're not good enough. Until a white person says you're good. And you can see even platforms where some of the most embarrassing black people are made, they call a black person who is going to speak ill of other blacks and say, yeah, you see, even he says so. So this is how apartheid has always worked and how the system worked. So we lost what I call ideological clarity, and we lost the ability to understand that until you master the narrative, you'll always be a victim. And so we should not be surprised that where we are. So it is the judiciary plays that role, the academy plays that role, and these are structures of domination. So if we have to go forward, and as other people have called for radical economic transformation, and if you read what they're saying it represents that we need to start thinking of the structures of domination. We must think of the systems of domination. We must think of the process of domination. We must think of the patterns of ownership of the economy. So it is all-encompassing, and anybody who says that becomes a threat. Because now, no, this is not going according to script. The script was all written that in the end, it doesn't matter what they do, we'll still be in charge. So that is where we are today.
So, you mentioned a bit about how the system used the media and NGOs essentially to fool us.
Yeah.
Can we start unpacking also the Chapter 9 institutions?
Oh. Yeah. No, definitely. Actually, if you read Ngwagora Matlodi, he wrote a very brilliant article called The ANC's Fatal Concession. And these guys, when they framed the system, they wanted to say, what are the structures that we can rely on to undermine black people? Now, suddenly, you start having the Chapter 9 institutions. And their role is very simple. You don't see them participating largely in the advancement of the interests of African people. Most of the time, if they do, it happens to be accidental. But most of the time, it is more about holding the executive in check. So that has become the rule. So effectively, what Ngwagora Matlodi says in that, he says, you had an immigration or the moving of power from the executive to the judiciary, to the Chapter 9 institution, to the media, and you ask, who owns this? So one would like to talk, right now, we had hoped that the Chapter 9 institutions will play the role they're supposed to play. But if you take a case of Phala Phala, there's an attempt to undermine how serious the parliamentary is. Now I see the former Chief Justice has come out open, says the President Ramaphosa should have resigned. But we also know that President Mbeki also himself had actually said, when the ANC voted in that particular way, he asked, when you say the president should not be investigated, and the president has been very clear that he's innocent, what are you trying to tell the masses? Are you saying you suspect that the president, who has said he's innocent, that he may not actually be innocent? So now the Chief Justice, who I hold no brief for him, has now said the President Ramaphosa has become a problem, he should have resigned, and is a problem in terms of dealing with the issue of corruption. But what people forgot is that there's been emphasis only on the money. But of course, it's embarrassing to have a whole president putting money, or having his money, or money is supposed to be his, as Judge Rogers said in the Constitutional Court, to say, let us not beat about the bush, because what you found is that the lawyers, largely black, and defend the president, were talking about whether the panel found sufficient evidence, whether it was prima facie, and Judge Rogers, who happens to be white, says, but colleagues, here are the facts that are not in dispute. That the matter was not reported for 2 years. 2, that the money should have been declared, it was not declared. 3, that anybody who is a businessman would have made sure that this money goes to the bank. And the former president, Mbeki himself, said, this almost makes of money laundering. So that is very serious. That's why Zondo could say now, when it's convenient, to say President Ramaphosa should have resigned. But now you ask, where are the foundations? The so-called NGOs. You have luminaries in the court of law, like Judge Ngobo, who was a former Chief Justice, whose job as a judge is to look at evidence. You have Judge Masipa, a retired judge, whose job is, and they're saying here, we can reasonably say there's a case to answer. The NGOs are not there. But you see them very active. If you mention Zuma, they will be so active because that's what they exist to do. So what we have here, we have a crisis of thought, a revolutionary thought. And the sooner we start reclaiming that, and it cannot happen simply piecemeal. That's why the idea of radical economic transformation makes sense. Because what people fail to understand also, when you talk about radical economic transformation, you are also talking about not only the patterns, is to say our economy as it stands, it is an economy that is informed by a colonial pattern. I mean, what we do, the colonialists simply come here to extract our resources. And that continues. You'd have thought that by now we'd have moved into beneficiation. And this is what's part of the so-called radical economic transformation says. We need to move towards beneficiating these resources. And I need to explain what that means. When you beneficiate resources, you do what people call in legal terms and business terms, you beneficiate your minerals. And now, to explain this even much more simpler, there's an article that was written by KPMG many years ago, I think it's 2014, it's called Africa Rising, and it looks at what beneficiation does, and it looks at coffee. It says Africa produces about $5 billion of coffee, or 5 billion pounds. And this coffee is taken out as it is. And the way it's taken, it gets processed. And when it gets processed, there are jobs that get created. So when you export it, you are almost
Exporting jobs.
you are exporting jobs. So, but they say in taking it out, the people there, they take coffee as it is, they process it, then they brand it, they market it, and it comes down from 5 billion pounds, it becomes now $100 billion industry. So effectively, this is what we do with all our minerals because there's no beneficiation. So when you talk about the radical economic transformation, it also means making sure that you disrupt the colonial imprint that informs our economy. But you say that, oh, no, you're talking about stealing. That's why Nkosazana says we must never fall into that nonsense. That when we talk about economic, radical economic transformation, we're talking about making sure that these resources become our resources and they benefit us. But as we speak now, we have abandoned that idea of beneficiation. What we do, we are simply happy with Uncle Sam. I mean, we are in such a bad state that even today, to change the name of a street, you have to worry what Trump will say. I mean, can you imagine? We have and then you have a former ambassador who has been expelled, and the people of this country says he's one of our own. We're going to welcome him. Then you have the president of the country says, no, be careful how you welcome him because we don't want to. Exactly. And this is the same president who told us that we will not be bullied. So what we have now is that it's time for us to go back to the drawing board. And the drawing board means how did we get it wrong? And as I said, until you control the mass narrative, you have no chance of winning. Karl Marx put it very nicely, that the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. But what he was simply saying is that you need to control the ideas. If you don't control that, and he went also further to say, the class that has the means of material production has control at the same time to the means of mental production. So this is why, because we don't control the media. The media, when you read some of the newspapers, it's almost like they're written by the same person.
Yeah.
Because they are there to serve a purpose. And the purpose is to control the narrative. And if you don't control the narrative, you don't control the future. So the sooner we make sure that our universities participate in the control of the narrative, the better for us. Otherwise, we are back to square one. We'll have to go back to the struggle. But right now, the sad reality is that we have a country or a government that is controlled by the minority. I mean, I like Helen Zille for one thing, because she's straightforward. She says, you know, I have committed myself to making sure that by the time in my lifetime, the ANC will be no more. She's very clear. So she's not participating in the GNU without it. Her agenda is very clear. It says by the time we are done, and people used to think that apartheid will not die in the lifetime, I'm going to make sure that the ANC dies in my lifetime. So the DA has a very clear agenda. And she goes to say, white people here, there's only about 8% of us. But we need to find a way in which, despite our lack of numerical strength, we run the show. And right now, if you get whatever Helen says, Helen gets. So she's probably one of the smartest strategic politicians. I mean, people may not like her politics, but the DA is making strides. And she said, what we need to do is, by going into the government of national unity, all we want to show is what we did in the city of Cape Town. That where we govern, we do it better. That we'll do it better than the black people. And that's where we are. The fear that Mandela said, that he fears that those who are opposed to the changes harbor the notion that in the not so distant future, they'll be able to reverse the gains. And we can see the gains being reversed because we don't control the narrative. And fortunately, I must say, now that we have social media, like your platform, this social media that disrupting, that's why people don't like even social media. And of course, there are others who use social media for other things. They don't use it for educating African people. Others use social media to hate black people. Yeah. I mean, there's some people who are so committed to hating everything that I stand for, and they're not taking even challenging the ideas that I put. Theirs is driven by the how can we destroy. And this is also what apartheid did, to say we must also make sure that black people hate each other so much. I mean, look at, you have people who have been accused of having committed atrocities during apartheid. You don't see the NGOs, you don't see the NPA being said, let's get those people. But if the black person, you see how active. And hence I said, what we are also experiencing in this country is the weaponization of the NPA. And the good example is that of Duduzane. And this needs to be said as often as possible, that when you have the media that has branded a young man to be a fugitive from justice, and that the very same media and some of the people who are in the NPA decide that we are going for him, the young man comes to do the most honorable thing, to bury his own brother. He gets quickly arrested, shackled, like he's a violent criminal, taken to court, and there's no case. And after that, desperate that we must find something, they come up with a known case again. And they charge him again, it fails. And you don't hear the so-called NGOs talk about the abuse or this state capture. So what we have here is that we need to get to a stage where we can make sure that we disrupt this logic of apartheid that continues to inform our politics. And that means we need to look at, take, for instance, this notion of detention without trial. I mean, black people don't need the judges to tell them that. They've been through it. They know it. We don't need the judge to tell us what is just. Let me actually even put the most even disturbing example of our judicial system. You would have thought that our black people would also make the court much a safer space for our people, where if they go to court, they don't have to transact the business of justice in a language they don't understand. But you have our black judges so proud that they can quote Roman Dutch law, and they can speak in a language that their people don't understand, and they don't see anything wrong with that. And yet, when a white person goes into court, I mean, I had a case of a traffic fine where I wanted to contest the fine. When I got there, the magistrate was African speaking. It was in Naboomspruit. The traffic cop was African speaking, and I suggested that and the prosecutor was African speaking. I said that I would like this matter to be conducted in English. They said, no, we'll get an interpreter. I said, no, I want this to be conducted in the language I understand. But the magistrate and the prosecutor understood that it would be difficult for them. Hence, their requirement that they wanted the whole thing to be done in the language where the language is their mental home. But our own judges can't even see that, as black as they are. Then you actually say you can expect those people to be the people who are going to be transformative. If they cannot even understand that justice is not written in color, that every language is capable of making sure that justice can be served. So this is but they are so proud to speak a language and to judge our people instead of simply saying, and then they say, no, you want an interpreter who also makes mistakes. So if we cannot even turn into that, we fall into what Ngugi had long defined. He says, you see, the gun, the gun was an instrument and a machinery of physical oppression and subjugation. And language is an instrument and a machinery of a spiritual subjugation. That when, as some people say, you are what you speak. When people like Makhoba were talking about having to make sure that our people do not think that language are not incapable of dealing with issues of justice. He says we need to do that. And the Justice Maranga of the Constitutional Court made one comment some time back. He says the most interesting thing for him is that he has seen some of the cases before him. When he listens to them, he can see that the law says this. But he says he has learned to listen to his inner voice. It says his inner voice is a voice that does not talk law. It talks justice. And we need to make a distinction that there's a difference between the law and justice. Those are not the same.
Yes.
And what we have is more of the law than justice.
Yes.
And what we have is, but because these people are the ones who wrote the law, they push the idea of the law. They talk about the rule of law. When in effect they're saying, no, we're talking about that which gives us an advantage.
Yes.
So effectively, when we're talking about moving forward, now that we know, I mean, there have been these missteps, what should be clear is more of the same is not going to work. We need to start rethinking. We need to recalibrate. It's almost like when you're driving and you're lost and you discover that you were going this way and you discover that then you recalibrate. Now it's time for black people to recalibrate. To simply say, it cannot be correct that in the country where we are a majority, wherever you find black people, they are congested. Where blackness means being poor, being hopeless, carrying the burden of disease. Where we say in our country where we are a majority, and this is what also some of my Nigerian friends says, that what is South Africa? South Africa is simply a black country for whites. And they are actually correct. So what we need to do is to say, how do we reclaim this? But using the same instrument that had failed us, it will be the height of stupidity for us to continue to believe in that. So what we have is a challenge to say, are we ready for the next struggle? And the next struggle again goes back to having ideological clarity, to know who are the forces that are gain. I mean, the ANC used to talk about the motive forces. Which forces are likely to lead to a process where there's an advantage that black people get in terms of their own emancipatory project. And then we ask, what are those instruments that have been used and that are used? And what it will mean then is that we would then say, if you have these NGOs and they do not play the role, then you must ask the question that Mandela asked. That these, when he says these are not really NGOs, because they don't even enjoy support. And we know most of these NGOs. And as I say, they never stand for anything that advances black people, most of them. They simply exist to undermine black progress. And you see them with cases that they take. I mean, we used to have the judiciary will tell you, for example, that transparency is the most important aspect of democracy. But when it comes to Ramaphosa, transparency does not matter. They will tell you that you had organizations like the Right to Know. Right now, would have been knowing who gave the Ramaphosa all this money in 2017. Would be talking about the CR17 funds. And you must also remember that even Mokweng raised that issue. But also remember that when Mokweng was appointed, it was the same media that called him a Zuma judge, until he found against Jacob Zuma. Before then, he was presented as a skunk of the judiciary. But when you find against somebody they hate, suddenly you have earned stripes. So effectively, we need to subject, as Mahoba suggested, we should have subjected the universities to the TRC, that what role have you played during apartheid? We should have subjected the media to that as well. We should have subjected some of the churches into that. But what we did was simply to reduce apartheid to simply acts of individuals and exonerated the entire system that apartheid was built on.
So, when you speak of radical economic transformation, because the white people own the media, they've almost made it seem like it's a swear word. It's a bad thing. So can you unpack what radical economic transformation is? And, make it make sense to the layman, even with the land issue, when people say, what do we need land for? So RET and land, unpack it for us so that we understand what...
Yeah, I think those who came up with the word, this term, one is somebody who probably regrets for explaining it. It's somebody, Rob Davis. If you were to get his speech in Parliament in 2018 or 2019, he unpacks what radical economic transformation is. He unpacks it as ensuring that you are changing, most importantly, the colonial imprint that informs our economy. That our economy, radical economic transformation will mean, among other things, that you move towards beneficiation of your minerals so that you don't export jobs. So that is the first thing that it says. And the likes of Jacob Zuma also defined it differently to say that radical economic transformation should also mean that we must look at the structures, the systems that make it difficult for us to achieve what Oliver Tambo said we should achieve, which is that when he said, it makes no sense that you could have a liberation when you don't have control of the economy. So radical economic transformation is an attempt to say, how do we launch the next struggle?
What is the economy?
The economy would be who owns the minerals, and it comes down to the land issue. If you don't own the land, and it's interesting how white people will tell you that the land doesn't matter. You know what they do? They come up with what they call pseudo-research, where they ask black people, what do you really want? And people say, no, jobs. And they say, see, we looked at the people, and most people talk about jobs. But what they don't say is that if you ask them whether the land doesn't matter, Black people will tell you, no, no, we want jobs and we also want the land. But what you have this artificial separation. I mean, I give people an example, and the interesting thing is that the very same white people who tell you that black people don't want land, I have asked them a question that if black people don't want land and land is unimportant, why are you spending so much money trying to make sure that you keep it? Because they tell you that, no, we don't want land, but they want to keep it. And if it doesn't matter, I say, no, but then you would not want to keep the land because it doesn't matter. So you need to make sure that when you talk about radical economic transformation, it means also having to address the unfinished business of struggle, which is to ensure that, among other things, the land returns to the people. I mean, it really doesn't make sense that you can have an individual owning a mountain and a river, and down there you find black people in conditions of squalor, congested in the country of their birth. So if people don't understand what radical economic transformation means, it should mean, among other things, the return of that land. If the land is not returned, you cannot talk about radical economic transformation, because in that land, the land, as most people will tell you, the land also is a space where the wealth of the people is. So when you talk about that, you're also talking about returning that wealth of the people to the rightful owners. But that's what the people are saying, no, we should not talk about that. So they have made sure that they come up with pseudo research to say black people don't want land. But as some people will tell you, the mere fact that you find us congested in small spaces, that's an expression of land hunger. You go to areas away from the cities, where in the homelands, where people have land, you look at the houses that they build, they don't build shacks. The reason why they build shacks is because they are not sure that tomorrow they'll be bulldozed. So now we present it as if we are shack dwellers. But the reason why our people build shacks is because of land hunger. They have put themselves there. But it's not because they want that, they want to. And you must also understand that, as Malema put it, that most of these people, no white person has came to Africa carrying land in their suitcases. So what people are asking is the most simplest thing, but we make it appear so difficult. What the radical economic transformation says is that it cannot be business as usual. That's all it says. That we need to address the unfinished business of transformation. And the unfinished business of transformation means that all those instruments that have been used against our people must be revisited. And we are beginning to see, at least young people are raising that issue. They are raising it in terms of education. That the education we have is a colonial education. It's also part of radically changing the system. That we cannot claim to be free while we still have this type of education as what we have. The education that valorizes whiteness. And look, we learned more about the Bismarcks of this world than we learned about Moshoeshoe. And if you listen to Mandela's speech, he says when he grew up, he learned about Moshoeshoe, he learned about Hintsa, he learned about Sikukuni. Yeah, that was now what you call anti-colonial education, not an education that makes him doubt who he is. So the radical economic transformation has to do with the economy. In whose hands is this economy? Yeah. And all the people who run the economy will tell you that that's one thing they don't want. That much they are very clear, that they do not want you to control the economy. So we should not make it any more difficult. The struggle for this country was not simply about black people being in position of power. It was also about making sure that black people become what you call the people who determine their own future.
And the irony behind also this economic thing is that the economy is the money, right? And the politicians and the political parties don't have the money if they don't have the economy, which means that they're going to have to go to the people who own the economy for...
Exactly. And this is why right now, when you talk about change, the DA talks about the market. What they're saying is that you need to think about the people who are our sponsors. And what is it that they're sponsoring? The sponsorship is simply based on ensuring that the status quo remains. So right now, the language of the so-called market must be seen for what it is. It is to say, don't tamper with the status quo. And you ask, I mean, look, 2025, we have a scenario where black households earn 5 times less. So how can you even call that a form of freedom? When your people have become simply people who live in conditions of squalor. And that is the reality of being black in the world today. Yeah. And when your child grows, and this is why in the US, black children ask their parents, Daddy, when am I going to turn white? Because they look at the material conditions. Until we address the material conditions of our people, we are not free. Yeah. We are not yet there. And this is where the challenge is. The challenge is to make sure that this freedom does not mean simply voting. And you know what they do? They keep us busy with voting. I'll give you a very interesting and depressing scenario. I was invited by the IEC to what they call the signing of the Code of Conduct. And this was 2019. And on stage, there were 48 parties contesting. And only 2 of them were largely white parties. It was the DA and the Freedom Front Plus. And the interesting thing about it is that the Freedom Front Plus was very clear that it's going to take the Afrikaner vote. And the DA was very clear that it's going to take mainly the English vote. And black parties that are also funded by the same people who funded, there's 46 of them. Now you're talking about the divide and rule. And interestingly, they were all taking this without any sense of irony, that how can we, 46 parties that are black, not see that this is part of the divide and rule? So we have made this notion, and what these people do is keep us busy for elections. We no longer have an agenda. The agenda, even as we speak, is that no, let's look at 2026. And after 2026, then we get busy with another busyness of 2029 elections. So we are caught up in the election mode. Yes. We're no longer addressing what the struggle was all about. The struggle was very clear. It was the struggle, the emancipation of African people in particular, and black people in general. Now we're busy with the election. We are caught up in election mode that we forgot what the struggle was about. So the struggle now is about who gets into position. And now the ruling party, its existence is now very clear. It now exists only to be in power. Doesn't matter how it gets into that power. It no longer talks the language of liberation. And that's what they'll tell you, talk about efficiencies and all that, but they don't talk about the language of liberation, which is the language we should be talking about. So we need to also understand that the sustenance of the apartheid ideology is driven by black disunity. And these guys have mastered the art of dividing black people. That's why people are afraid of the so-called unity of the African people. Because unity of the African people means for once Africans will be able to determine their own agenda. But at the moment, the agenda is not set by Africans.
Yes. Hey, time flies when you're having a good time. Now, as we wrap up, I want us to unpack, because earlier on you spoke about Mbeki specifically, and you spoke about the shareholders and how people are silenced with shares. And can we just compare the three presidencies, like with Mbeki, Zuma, and Ramaphosa, and how that plays out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very simple thing. And actually, what I would also ask people to look at is the narrative of 9 wasted years.
Yes.
You know, because at least we now know that it is actually rubbish. Because if you do a simple Google, you look at things like Kroc, you look at, you ask, post 1994, which president has contributed a lot in terms of infrastructure? Google, not us, will tell you. It was under Zuma that you had what you call 3 universities that were built. The very same person who is said not to be educated, but he sees the need to make sure that there are at least new universities. 2, you also have the people who will tell you, including the likes of Montashe, that it was under Zuma that the lifespan of black people increased, life expectancy, by 10 years. And what we have with the Ramaphosa are promises. Remember, there was this notion of Ramaphosa, which was simply a media creation. Now everybody knows. I mean, if you read people like Duma, Ngubule, he'll tell you that in his estimation, Ramaphosa is probably the worst president we've had. And we also know that when it comes to Mbeki's gripe with Zuma is that just like Kgalema, these were the people who were defeated. Mbeki was defeated in a political context by somebody he despises. And he was defeated at a time when he was a sitting president. That with all the so-called black intellectuals, with the media on his side, he was beaten fair and square. So when it comes to political strategy, we know that who it's a matter of public record. And it does not mean that Jacob Zuma has not had his own mistakes. There have been misses here. There have been major mistakes that he has made. But what people could actually say is that if you listen to many of them, they will say he did the best he could. Ramaphosa, the only time I saw him being excited about anything is when he was fixing a pothole on a gravel road. I mean, the Citizen wrote an editorial that the ANC, when they saw Ramaphosa fixing a pothole, being excited, they say the ANC has normalized abnormality. So what we have, as people said, that the one thing that Ramaphosa is good at is to come up with commissions, task teams. And now with this notion of Pala, he can no longer be the one who can pontificate about anti-corruption. He is now ill-qualified to talk about anti-corruption. And the judiciary, unfortunately, has not done us a favor, neither has the NPA. They, instead of investigating that matter, as Judge Rogers said, and as Judge Ngobo had said, the former Chief Justice, that there was an intention to make sure that this is not known. That this money that was taken, had it not been Fraser. And we also know that other acts of criminality occurred. That the people were first hounded, that the people were kidnapped. People were tortured to make sure that they get that money. We also know, as a matter of fact, that the former president of Namibia was called upon to assist. So here was a president who says, but all these are proceeds of selling cattle. Then you ask, if there were proceeds, why was this notion of making sure that this is not known? So the jury is still out on him. But at least I'm glad that the Chief Justice, who himself should not have been a Chief Justice, has now pronounced to say the man should have resigned. So that's as far as I can say about these three presidents.
It's so fascinating how the blacks who get used somehow find their sobriety after they've been used.
Definitely.
You know?
Yep.
Because I even saw Mamtuli Matonzela now, Agasazngeni, when they tried to use her again. She's just like...
No. But what is interesting is that the extent to which we now have people who were implicated by the TRC to have played a major role in the killings of our people. You have the NPA that doesn't seem to have any interest in that. Here you have a president, for all over the world, people are shocked that you can have a president who will hide money under the mattress. And as a matter of fact, the DA went out of its way to say, it is so convinced that there's an issue of money laundering here that they would are prepared to go and raise that matter with the FBI. But that was before they got into power.
Yes.
Yeah. But they were very clear. They had a press conference to say, we are very clear that what we're dealing with here. In the same way that Mbeki asked the members of the ANC, that when you vote this way, and the president says he's innocent, why can't you believe your president? Is it because you know deep in your hearts that he's got the case to answer? That's why I'm saying he is no longer qualified to teach anybody and talk to anybody about corruption.
It's interesting how the DA also keeps dangling this pala issue. Every time things don't go their way, then suddenly they find their moral high ground again.
No, definitely. Look, it's the vantage point. And people know one fully well that those who support the DA are the same forces that are not only beneficiaries of the system, but they are the same forces that they know that when it comes to even the issue of law, we have written that law. We understand it fully. So that the judges that we select are carefully chosen. We are not going to choose any judge who's crazy. That's why they were so angry with the appointment of Mogoeng, because it was not an appointment that they had sanctioned. So we need to understand, one, the forces of resistance and their relative capacity as we move forward. We need to understand that until such time that the African people are not pariahs in the land of their forebears, there is no Uhuru. And we need to also be able to understand that accepting the narrative that is told by people who have never had any interest in you is not going to be in your favor. That these things are done to make sure that the liberation of African people is actually frustrated. That's why I call that what we need is now a form of recalibration. And that recalibration means that we must be able to control the narrative. And the ideas that should inform us should be the ideas that takes us forward, but that are also informed by the interest of liberation of African people. If we don't do that, then our struggle will be meaningless.
And then just in closing, then where to from here? Then, as you're saying, and what are the practical ways? How do we fix what's happening?
Well, at universities, young people are already calling for the curriculum to be changed, for the curriculum to start speaking or to become curriculum that reflects African people, their history, that we are not free floating in space. We have a history as African people. So they have called for that. Within the black parties, they need to also to start defining who is a friend, who is an enemy. They need to be able to define who is an opponent, because we should not be fighting against each other. We should be not turning on each other, but we must turn to each other for support. So what it means that we need to go back to the black consciousness philosophy, because that was a liberatory philosophy. And it is not an accident that the likes of Biko were killed, because that philosophy was the most powerful instrument that African people had. And it is not an accident that Biko was hated while he was alive and even when he was dead.
There's so many things. I hope that you're going to come back again, because we've only touched the tip of the iceberg. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking about now is how brazen the system is in dealing with black people. When you were speaking about informal settlements, you always see black people's houses being bulldozed and stuff, but then you've got an issue of Orania, where they don't use the same...
Oh, no, definitely. No, make no mistake. I mean, the system is vicious when it comes to black people. And the bulldozing, which sometimes happens at the behest of black people, is it's one of those things that tell you that we still have a lot to do as African people. We are, as I indicated, that even the people who killed our own are running amok. But look at the activism that we have when we have to deal with black people. That as Moses Kakan put it in the establishment, the launching of Pabasa, he said, if I were to ask any of you to close your eyes and to think about who is your enemy, and he says, it is most likely somebody who looks like you. This is what the system has done to black people. It has made sure that we hate each other so much that the only time we become active is when we want to attack our own. So that is where the challenge is. And I think the young people are now beginning to redefine that. They are asking, we've been told that we are a born-free generation, but we don't see this freedom. We see more of the same. So we have a better chance with the young people today to say, for as long as oppression exists, the struggle continues. The people like Alan Busak have come to the fore to say, now is the time to make sure that we cannot leave this legacy of oppression to the younger people. We must make sure that we also play our part. So it becomes the responsibility of every black person. But of course, when you say that, we must also be very clear that just like it was the case under slavery, you will have the Uncle Toms.
Yes.
Those that the system will use. And it's not very hard to find those. Those are largely the microwaved millionaires. Those who did not have to, those who were, the system was very clear. It said, give them shares. And then once you give them shares, then you control them. They don't have to contribute anything. So we have people who are suddenly have become rich and they have nothing to show for it. And some were told were business people, when in fact, now we know that that was simply an illusion.
I know. And then there's just so many things that keep coming up. Sorry. They keep trying to soften us up to DA power.
Yeah.
And the last time white people were in power, it was a mess and horrific for black people. I mean, for example, the Land Act, it's so easy. It was so easy for them, to just make us animals, which is something that we haven't done. as in black leadership, we haven't made it horrific
Sure.
for white people. So now this conversation around, because you keep seeing some black people start to relax around the idea of DA and white leadership.
Yeah.
Can we just...
No, I mean, look, the DA is very clear about his proposition. I mean, whatever mistakes the ANC make, that's why it's very important that even when you deal with the ANC, and as Floyd Shibambo put it, that they see the ANC as a contested opponent. They don't say it is our enemy. They say it's a contested political opponent. We need to also to understand, be clear about who are our opponents. And the people who have far to gain. This is why the notion that the ANC used to use of the so-called motive forces, who are the groupings that are most likely to gain when we embark on the struggle. And the DA, what has been their posture over the years? How has it treated the black leaders? I mean, you talk about people like Musimaimani, you talk about Mampela Rampela, you talk about Lindiwe Masibuko. All these people who thought that they were it. You talk about the Petria Deleo, their experience. And you will always find that it is only after black people have gone through that you talk about the Herman Mashaba. They don't seem to have a very good story to tell. So why would you want to say the DA is your answer? And the only thing that the black people have is to find unity amongst themselves. And that seems to be something that is very difficult for them to get. But I don't think at the moment, if one wants to talk about the DA, they must actually ask black people who thought they were special. They were in no time reminded that there's nothing special about them.
There are no better blacks.
There are no better blacks. Exactly.
Prof, it's been such a privilege. We could drink forever from you. Well, thank you so much. I don't know if Getzo's got any questions.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yo, umoya ulight, umoya ubright. Guys, I promise we'll bring him back. Yes, we will bring him back. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And thank you for always supporting the channel. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir,
for inviting me.
Who are you when all you were has been diluted by lies and white lines cancelling out all that which has been written of your history? Why do you look at yourself as a mystery? Doesn't the sun shine because you open your eyes? Doesn't the moon stay situated within the same stars your DNA sparkles off? Your spirit knows that surely corner into it off. Buza umoya so you may return to being well off. Because spiritually you are rich, yet your ancestors cry because you are out of reach. But yours is to command all elements while God takes inspiration from the very mirror she looked at to become. Remember who you are and never finish just when they think that with you they are done.